still to pursue martial art in Shaolin.
Yeah, so then I went to Shaolin, and the way I did that was I bought a ticket. I got a visa. I bought a ticket to Zhengzhou, which is capital Henan. I flew there. I had literally no plan. I just flew there. I got out of the airplane. I told a taxi I want to go to Shaolin, and he took me for like an hour, and he stopped and he said, "I have to get my friend." And they went and got some friends. Like there was like by the end, there was like 5 of us in this taxi, and we drove all the way to Shaolin.
Oh,
And I got there, and it was coming nighttime. The doors were closed, and I knocked on the gate. It was exactly like a movie. It was exactly like a movie. I'm just knocking on the gates of the Shaolin Temple. Please let me in. And a monk came, and he's wearing the robes, and it was cold out, and he kind of had a hood and everything. and I told him I want to stay there, and he brought me in, and then I got to meet this monk, that monk, and they eventually agreed to allow me to stay. And then the taxi left, and they stole my money.
the temple you went to were the Shaolin per se, because you mentioned in your book that actually when people talking about go to Shaolin, I mean the area where
Yeah,
a lot of different
yeah. So I have two books. The first one is called The Monk from Brooklyn. That is about my visit to the real Shaolin Temple in 2003. So when I got there, I actually was at the actual Shaolin Temple, and I slept there for a few nights. And then one of the monks agreed to take me as a student, so he moved me to his house outside. So all the monks had these houses outside of the temple where the students slept. 2013, I went back to the Shaolin Temple, but by that time you could not get anywhere near the temple. I mean, maybe as just as a tourist, but not to train or anything like that. So it's a very different experience. So the second book talks about that. But the first book, I actually started at the temple, slept inside the temple, ate with the monks. Then they moved me to the house outside, and I would have generally 3, 4 training sessions a day, and one of those would be inside of the actual temple, which is pretty amazing. Yeah,
So you got what you wanted,
I got what I wanted.
but why did you move on?
So I was considering staying for a year, and then the SARS epidemic started, and essentially all foreigners had to leave China, so I left. But when you say I got what I wanted, it's very interesting. Also, they say never pray that you're going to get what you want because it's not really what you want. So I got in there. It was an amazing experience on many levels, but I discovered that they couldn't fight. There wasn't really any fighting, and
What did you really want?
I see that's the question at that point. I think that I really wanted to learn to fight more, but I went there thinking I wanted to learn more martial art, traditional martial art. But when I got in there, I realized, no, I'm actually not that interested in traditional martial art. I really just want to learn to fight more, and they don't do that here. And I also was still a little bit, because this is 2003, so I'm still a little bit under the spell, under the belief that somewhere there's a temple, there's a cave, there's a jungle, somewhere there's a master teaching these guys. No one's heard of him, no one's seen him, and he has the secret. And I realized, okay, well, the secret's not at the Shaolin Temple. So when I left, it was probably just as good, just as well that I left.
It's quite a romantic idea.
Yeah, it's quite a romantic idea.
So you left at the time because of the SARS, but you still kept pursuing that kind of dream in
Yeah.
other places of Asia.
Yeah, I went back to Taiwan. I went to Hong Kong, then I was in Taiwan for a while again, training again, and then I had outgrown Taiwan pretty quickly because I absolutely love Taiwan, of course, and I love the culture and the people. As far as martial art or fighting goes, it's very limited in Taiwan, and I already kind of knew all the teachers in Kaohsiung, and there's about 2 or 3 fight schools in Taipei, and when I check online now, it's like the same 2 or 3 now that were 20 years ago, so I sort of outgrew Taiwan in a way. And I was watching Guojia Dili on the TV, National Geographic, and they had a report about a monk in Thailand who was teaching Muay Thai to orphans. And I said, I want to go study with him. So I went to Thailand and I found him and I lived with him for a long time. And that's where I learned Muay Thai. And that's when I said, wow, these guys really fight. And this is really all about fighting. But because I learned from him first, it had the philosophy, it had the religion, it had the virtue, it had all the other things that really appealed to me. So yeah.
But Muay Thai couldn't keep you stay.
No. So I was there for a while, and I realized that Muay Thai is great, but I was never going to be great at Muay Thai. But Muay Thai was great, and then it's for one thing, they start very young. They start so young. These guys will have, Muhammad Ali is our most famous boxer, or if you take Mike Tyson, these guys have like 50 or 60 fights in a career. Rocky Marciano had, I believe, 49 fights. These Muay Thai guys will have 300 fights, 350 fights. and they just grew up doing that and nothing else. So I was there, and I loved Kru Ba a lot. And I said, well, if I that was the name of the monk, and I said, well, if I stay here with him, I'll learn more culture, language. The Muay Thai, I'm probably never going to be great. And also, I realized this wasn't the best place to train. I'd have to go to one of the professional camps somewhere, and then it wouldn't have the cultural part. So, all right. So I looked, and I found out that there was a lost martial art in Cambodia that that people had talked about, believed it existed. Nobody had found it. I said, okay, I'm going to go to Cambodia and find that martial art.
That term I don't know how to pronounce.
Book tour?
Yeah. So you eventually kind of master it?
Well, yeah, I eventually found the master. I went to Cambodia. I was boxing and doing different martial arts, and then eventually I found the book tour master. I began studying with him, and then about 3 years, 4 years later, me and one other American were promoted to black belt on the same day. We were the first foreigners.
So there's a form with which you can really fight, right?
That's what I thought. I was driven those first 10 years of my martial arts odyssey in Asia. I was driven by a belief that there would be a traditional martial art that I would discover, which you could actually use for fighting. And as I was going on, I was finding out not really, kickboxing. We all know kickboxing is fighting. It's professional fighting. So in Thailand, you have Muay Thai. Cambodia, you have Brat Saray. These are just different forms of kickboxing. In China, you have Sanda. So that's fighting. But at all these years, I was going country to country and trying these martial arts, and I would just discover, well, no, this isn't really a fighting art. There's culture, there's history, there's lots of wonderful reasons to learn it, but not for fighting.
So you moved on.
So I moved on. Yeah.
Moved back to China.
Went to Korea, Philippines, Malaysia, and then I started fighting professionally again when I got to Malaysia. I fought a little bit of professional boxing in Asia before that, and then in Malaysia is where I started fighting professional MMA. And I did that for a year that I was a pro. I lived inside the MMA academy, just training and fighting. And by that point, I'd pretty much given up on traditional martial art. I said, I guess there's nothing out there. And I just lived in the academy. I trained full-time MMA, and I was winning most of my fights. I only had one loss as a pro. However, my body, by that point, I was in my 40s, and my body was really taking a beating. And the academy didn't have air conditioning. In Malaysia, of course, is very hot, very humid. So we'd train 3 times, and then I'd try to sleep in that hot, humid. I wasn't resting properly. I was fighting frequently. I was sparring frequently. And every month, I was a little bit less mobile. My body was injured a little bit more, excuse me. And my body was injured a little more. And so by the end of that year, I said, I think I need to get out of here for a while because I'm going to get hurt. So I went online. I was looking for a teaching job, and I found a great university teaching job at Shanghai University. So, and I'd always wanted to go back to China because I sort of felt like I left prematurely when I was there, and I spoke Chinese. And in Malaysia, I lived in a Chinese gym in a Chinese community, speaking Chinese every day. In Cambodia, I lived and worked with Chinese. My Chinese were my translators. The local Chinese would speak Cambodian to people and translate to Chinese for me. So Chinese had been a part of my life this whole 10 years or so in Asia, 10 or 11 years by that point. And so, okay, I want to go back to mainland China. So I went back, and I was teaching at Shanghai University.
What did you teach? You wrote it in a book, but I didn't really specifically know.
So there was at Shanghai University, there was a cooperation with a university in Australia, University of Technology, Sydney, and they had their own business department, and they taught business and English. So I got in there and I taught business research courses.
So, but it's kind of funny because the NA, as far as I remember, started to develop in the 90s.
Yes, yes.
When Gracie family, the impact, how they impact the North American martial art world, it's quite impressive. Quite
yes.
Memory. But you, at the time when the MMA developed, you were looking for how to fight in the traditional.
Yeah.
But didn't you pay attention to what's going on in MMA?
Yeah, I was watching the videos, but at that time, remember, there was very limited internet, and there were 10 UFC videos that they sold in a box set of 10, and I watched that set 100 times, just over and over and over, because there was nothing else. I would watch that, and if I could find the fights on TV during the 90s. But during the 90s, there weren't a lot of schools and things yet. There wasn't the availability that there is today. So also in the 90s, I still believed there was some kind of an answer in traditional martial art. That was the other thing. I thought, I'm going to go back to the roots of martial art. And then later decided, okay, well, no, the MMA was the way to go. But it took me a long time to come to that realization.
But you learn a lot of different
Yeah, learned a lot of different things. Yeah, and the interesting thing, something we talked about off camera was the mindset, how the culture and the mindset plays, and why the Asian athletes are different than the Western athletes, or particularly the American athletes. So MMA arguably started in 3 countries simultaneously. There's 3 countries that can claim to be the origin of MMA. Now, I'm going to say this is a controversial. I'm sure somebody will say, no, it was France or something, but no, it's Brazil, the United States, and Japan. And if we also think of Japan as being, other than China, probably the most famous sort of origin of martial arts in the West. And 2 Olympic sports now, judo and karate from Japan, sumo from Japan, right? These are household names. Every American, I don't care what your relationship to sports is, you've heard of karate, you've heard of judo, you've heard of sumo. We know about Japan, we know about the samurai, right? So MMA starts in these 3 countries. And Japan has this thousands of years history or hundreds of years history of martial arts. Until very recently, there has not been a Japanese champion in the UFC.
recently.
Yeah, very recently. The first Japanese champion was Kazushi Sakuraba, who is one of my absolute heroes.
It's insane.
He won a lot of things. He won a lot of honors in the 90s. But yes, and he beat 4 Gracies. But it was not called a UFC title. They were in Pride, and then he also fought in UFC and Pride. But even in UFC, in the beginning, they didn't quite have a system. The belt system and title system wasn't quite as developed as it is now. So they would sometimes have really big fights, but they were not considered title fights. So he won many of these things, but they were not titles. And only recently, in the last like 5 years or something, the UFC decided to award him. They converted a lot of these wins from the 90s to a title. So he became the first Japanese to get a title.
Oh, he's the first Japanese to.
Yeah.
But after that, there's not many.
Yeah, I don't think there's too many. I don't follow the sport as closely now, but my point is that hundreds of, or maybe thousands of years of martial arts history in Japan and China, and Japan is one of the birthplaces of MMA. And there have been a number of very, very good fighters out of Japan, and yet they weren't producing champions. Right? So there's something cultural. There's some difference when we go to wrestling and when we go to MMA. There's something different, and boxing even. There's something different about the mindset in the West and the East. That's what I believe, because we're all humans. We're all humans. We all have 2 arms and 2 legs. The same thing that makes me fall down makes a Japanese person fall down, makes a French man fall down. No matter where you're from, you'll fall down if somebody does this or that technique on you. And yet, the martial art is different in all of these countries. So if the people aren't different, why is the martial art different? Oh, the martial art must be different because of the culture. And then the rules of the fighting or the rules of the competition determine what is taught. So in other words, if you had a street fight, you're probably better to kick and punch, not just punch someone. Boxers never learn to kick. Why? Because it's not part of boxing rules. So the rules and the culture determine what is being taught and how people fight. And I think that that's why we see many Western champions in MMA and in wrestling as well. When I compare wrestling in Asia and wrestling in the United States, because
you call it creative thinking.
Creative thinking, yeah.